Great, have a seat. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the third session. Packed audience again. There is one seat, I believe. Is that free, that seat there? Yeah. There's one left if anybody needs a seat. This is quite a long session. We started this morning with decarbonising the built environment, and we moved on to retrofitting the built environment. We now move on to supply chain and decarbonisation of the supply chain, which is your moderator for this session is Will Arnold, Head of Climate Action, the Institution of Structural Engineers. And with him today, we've got 4 guests, speakers. Jenny Colville, Head of Sustainability. Hi, Jenny. John O'Dower, Head of Sustainability, Telford Homes, based in Telford. Matt Webster, Head of Environmental Sustainability, British Land. Oliver Novak, Technical and Innovation Director, Barratt's PLC Group. And finally, Claire Harrison, Development Director, The Crown Estate. Great, we've got you all here. I'll hand you over to Will for the session. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Hi, everyone. My name's Will. I am Head of Climate Action at the Institution of Structural Engineers, and I suppose I've probably been asked to moderate this session as somebody who I'm speaking to you on behalf of an institution. So we're a membership organisation. We have a royal charter. We exist for the public good. So I'm here with no sort of agenda other than that of generally trying to decarbonise the industry and save the planet from, putting our race into extinction. We're going to speak, we've got about an hour to talk about decarbonising the supply chain. We're probably going to spend the first half to 2/3 of that discussing a few topics that we've already sort of lined up as a group of panellists. There will be Q&A at the end, so please do scan the Slido, do the thing on your phone like you always do, and it will come up on this big black tablet in front of me so we can ask questions as we get on. We're going to talk about supply chain, and when we say supply chain, I suppose we're thinking of it as everything from the people who make your materials and your products right through those who transport them, get them to your building site, install them, maintain them, use them. It's quite a long chain. It involves quite a lot of people and quite a lot of steps. So it's quite knotty and it's quite complicated. And hopefully the 5 experts who I'm joined by, who represent the biggest developers and house builders in this country, understand supply chains a bit better than me and can therefore help you understand what it is we can do to help decarbonise with them. The last thing I want to say before we start the discussion is just that I think that today's conversation needs to be about action. It needs to be about progress and about how we're going to accelerate change. You're probably all well aware that as of last week, we've been hearing from researchers now that we're likely to achieve 1.5 degrees C temperature rise within the next 3 years. This is not a post-2030 thing we're talking about. This is here and now. And frankly, I think we'd all admit we're probably not doing quite as much as we wish we were doing. And the speed of change is not quick enough. So I think the big overarching question today is about how we do more and go faster and build on what we're starting to do already. So with that, I'm going to start by asking each of our panelists to introduce themselves and just speak for maybe a minute each on themselves, their company, and a bit about the sort of net zero work that they're doing. And I guess in no particular order, why don't we start with John and work our way back across?
Yeah, thanks, Will. So John O'Dwyer, Head of Sustainability, Telford Homes. We're a London-centric, mixed-use, build-to-rent developer. We set our net zero 2030 journey about 2 years ago. So we've split operational and embodied carbon targets within that roadmap. Something that may be of interest for you today is we've also got a supplier sustainability requirements document that's available on our website where we've cascaded a lot of our roadmap requirements in there to try and give you a bit of better visibility. And yeah, looking forward to an engaging conversation, Will.
Thanks, John. Jenny?
Hi, thanks so much for having me. So I'm Jenny. I head up sustainability at Landsec. We're a UK real estate company with a mixed portfolio of assets. similar to British Land, predominantly London offices. We also own retail destinations across the UK, like Bluewater in Kent, St David's down in Cardiff, and we've also got a growing growing pipeline of mixed-use urban neighbourhoods. So my role as head of sustainability is to make sure that as a developer and an owner of assets, we are designing, developing and managing our assets sustainably. And just to say what we mean by sustainable places or creating sustainable places, it's firstly about ensuring we're creating places that our communities want and need. Then it's about making sure that we're reducing our impact on the environment and transitioning to net zero, which is what we're talking about today. But also the third element is about making sure we're delivering a commercially viable product, a product that our consumers want to use. So it's that triple bottom line. I think in the spirit of the title, Decarbonising Our Supply Chain, 90% of our carbon emissions come from our scope 3 emissions. So that's our value chain. That's the emissions from how the energy consumed within our occupied spaces. That's the emissions from our construction activities. And that's the emissions from our suppliers. So it's critical that we engage with our supply chain, including our customers, on our journey to net zero.
Thanks, Jenny. Claire.
Great. Okay, well, hello everybody, and thank you for having me. I'm Claire. I'm a development director at the Crown Estate. And just to give you a little bit of an overview on the organisation, the Crown Estate has an incredibly broad portfolio, from urban centres across the country to significant rural land holdings, to some of the most sort of iconic and recognisable destinations within London and within the West End, and also the seabed around England, Wales and Northern Ireland. And what we do at the Crown Estate is we adopt a very long-term approach to everything we do that allows us to drive financial, social and environmental value for the long term, which ultimately allows us to deliver on our purpose of fulfilling shared and lasting prosperity for the nation. The climate crisis is very much at the heart and embedded within our organisation. It's one of our key strategic goals is supporting our role in supporting the UK on our transition to net zero. And we've got a few ways that we hope to achieve this. And the first is by supporting the decarbonisation of the supply power system through the introduction of green and renewable energies through the development of offshore wind farms. So as an example of that, our recent leasing campaign, round 4, will deliver over 7 gigawatts of clean renewable energy to the UK by 2030, which is fantastic. And another way is to look at the decarbonisation of our real estates across all of our land assets. So reducing operational carbon and introducing new innovations to support sustainability. And then thirdly, setting higher standards of ourselves for our new developments to ensure that they are actually contributing to that net zero journey and not acting as a hurdle. But so in summary, it's the real focus of everything that we do, and it's the kind of core of our business.
Thanks, Claire. Matt?
Lovely. Can I have some of those megawatts, please, or gigawatts even? That would be lovely.
Wow. For the nation.
Matt Webster, British Land, Head of Environmental Sustainability. British Land, very similar to Lands. We're a developer and an operator of space. I think it's about 14 billion under management, split between central London offices, campuses, so collection of offices around pedestrianised space, and then retail parks and shopping centres up and down the country. And then moving into logistics and lab space, which is giving me a bit of a headache, but fun to try and be dealing with. Our sustainability strategy is talked about in terms of greener spaces, thriving places, and responsible choices. And my responsibility in that is the greener places bit, which predominantly is around getting to net zero by 2030. Similar to John, set targets for embodied and operational carbon, trying to reduce our embodied by 50% to 2030, and our operational carbon by 75%. That 75% is underpinned by an improvement in energy efficiency, but we can get into more of that in just a moment.
We will, yeah. And Ollie.
Hi everyone, so my name is Oliver Novarkovich, I'm the Technical Innovation Director for Barratt. So Barratt deliver about 18,000 houses a year, so we're the biggest in the country. That That means I employ 6,000 people, 50,000 subcontractors, and hundreds of suppliers to deliver that. So linked to what we're talking today. I think for me it's important as a business we've really wanted to walk the talk. I suppose lots of people say that, and we'll get into it, but we were the first house builder to set science-based targets, which we'll talk more about today. We also were the first to set a zero home before all our homes will be zero carbon by 2030, and our operations by 2040 will be zero carbon. And then I suppose the walk the talk bit is we've built 2 of the first net zero houses to the new regulations, so to future homes, and importantly, so that's to really show direction of travel that we're committed to it, but also most importantly, we've done that with hundreds of our suppliers who are all learning from that journey, as well as our subcontractors.
Thank you. So you can see the experience we've got on this panel is, absolutely top end of the industry. You've got housing, residential, both high-rise and single-family homes. We've got commercial, everything from heritage through reuse, new build. So full experience here. And I guess let's start. I'd like, if we can, start maybe in the commercial space, and then we'll come on to residential afterwards. Because I think we do have to sort of treat the two as similar but different, right? And they have their own challenges, both of them. And I want to start by speaking about operational carbon. So for those of you who have maybe stumbled in here hoping to hear about drones or something and aren't quite sure, just a quick bit on lingo. We have operational carbon and embodied carbon, and together those make up the emissions of the built environment. Operational is stuff that comes from turning on and off light switches, air conditioning. So anything that uses power or uses water releases operational carbon. Anything to do with materials, anything you can touch, there's embodied carbon associated with that. So we'll start, if we can, by talking about the operational side of things. And I wonder if, Jenny, maybe I could start with you. Could you talk people through some of the sort of key challenges that you're faced in the commercial sector in terms of driving down operational carbon in the here and now?
Yeah, sure. I think firstly I'll just talk about what we're doing across driving down operational carbon across our standing assets. And Ollie sort of mentioned the science-based target reduction targets. So firstly, we have a net zero target in place aligned with a 1.5 degree warmer world. And that requires us to reduce our scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions by 47% by 2030, so nearly half by 2030. And then we're committed to reaching net zero by 2040. And that's across our scope 1, 2 and reported scope 3 emissions. So it's all very well and good to set targets, and many of us have set targets, but the nitty-gritty is how we're going to achieve those targets. So we had these targets, and we were like, well, what do we need to do to get to that 2030 target? So in 2021, we sat down and worked out what do we need to do to reduce those operational carbon emissions. And we established our £135 million net zero transition investment plan. And this investment will enable us to decarbonise our standing assets, and I'll tell you what the money is being used for, but also most importantly, meet that impending minimum energy efficiency standard, EPC-B, by 2030, which is what investors, occupiers are all asking for. So what that £135 million is doing, and I'll build on sort of the challenges in delivering that. The first thing, the majority of that fund is about taking gas-fired boilers out of our office portfolio and replacing with air source heat pumps, electric systems, and hopefully Crown Estate is going to support that decarbonisation of the national grid, because we need that to ensure that we aim to get to net zero. So majority is about taking away gas-fired boilers, putting in air source heat pumps. If anyone has seen a commercial-sized air source heat pump, they're about the size of a small caravan. And the challenges of implementing or retrofitting air source heat pumps in occupied spaces is an operational nightmare. Our operations team and development teams, we've been doing feasibilities this year and doing it within London offices where you've got occupiers still operating the business, so we don't want to upset their heating and ventilation while we're doing this. You've got limited space on our roofs. You've got limited space around our office portfolio to put cranes, to put these massive pieces of kit onto the roof. So it is a logistical nightmare and a key challenge in retrofitting our offices. The other element of that fund is also around just ensuring that we're operating our assets in the most efficient way. So that's simply about looking at our building management systems and making sure that our buildings are operating in the way that they're occupied. The third element of the fund, and a key thing that I think Matt can build on, is around customer engagement. So 50% of the emissions from our office portfolio is from the energy consumed in our occupied spaces. So we really need to partner with our tenants and customers, and we kicked off a really neat customer engagement program last year where we're supporting our office occupiers, identifying how they're using energy in those demises and coming up with recommendations on what they can do to reduce that energy consumption. So just, a little bit about how we're doing it across our standing assets.
Thanks. So Matt, I mean, do you want to talk a bit to that final point about engagement with the users? Because that sounds like the sort of here and now type activity that can make a real big difference today.
Yeah, the collaboration is going to be absolutely essential for us delivering our targets, and our customers come in, mirror the portfolio essentially. So you've got office customers, and they're usually in multi-let buildings where we're renting out individual floors. They're served by a central plant in the basement. We've undertaken net zero audits, and every building has a net zero pathway to decarbonisation, getting in the heat pumps and optimising the running of the plant. But it's essential to bring customers along with that and help them understand how they're performing in their space. And one of the big levers we can pull on that, I think, is digitalisation and better data. And there's a number of parts of that. There's getting hold of the data, so having smart metering and EMSs in your buildings and identifying the supply chain that can actually install those in an economic way. And then there's visualising that data, so getting it out of those systems and visualising it in a way so that it's insightful to your engineering teams, but also your customers. And then there's the education with customers. So almost an education piece around what good looks like for their space and how they can optimise it further. And then there's the Internet of Things and sensors. So understanding how space is being occupied so that you can optimise it further, and overlaying different data sets, not just the energy consumption data set, internal air quality, space use, things like that can really help you trim and optimise how that space is being used. And then that applies across into developments as well. So all of our developments now deploy a smart building design guide. What we're trying to get to is a universal digital language for the built environment, so you can suck all of this data out of a building and look at it at portfolio level, so one building can start learning from the next. That's a longer term vision with developing that, or putting that into all of our developments at the moment, but it's the data analysis that sits on top of that.
So I'm hearing a lot about technology, logistics behind that, data, needing to be able to sort of feed that back through. A lot of this sounds like, that there's a lot of, I guess the question is there a sort of skills gap that means that enabling all of this stuff to happen makes it quite hard? And I know, Claire, we talked a bit about this before. Do you want to come in on the sort of skills aspect of this? Because there's a lot of new things going on here, right?
Yeah, I suppose I mean, we are very much in the same space as Mark and Jenny in terms of a retrofit program to try and decarbonise our portfolio. We have actually in London, the majority of our portfolio are all heritage assets. So we've got the additional complexity of managing that transition within the constraints of the heritage assets. So
and trying to put those huge air source heat pumps on the roof of a heritage building is
within the constraints
again, right?
of listed buildings and that sort of thing. So, a truly complex Rubik's Cube to kind of to solve. But we've also started looking at what's the level of skill that is required, what's in the future to achieve this. And actually, we've recently collaborated with Grosvenor, Peabody, Historic England, and the National Trust to commission a piece of research into looking at what that skills gap might be to achieve what we need. And that piece of research identified that we need over 200,000 workers per year from now until 2050 solely on the retrofit of historic buildings to achieve the net zero carbon ambitions. And if you take a step back and say, well, actually today the estimate is actually there's only about 100,000 workers that are skilled in this space that are able to do that. We've got a really significant shortage. So we're working to kind of move that on and see what the implications of that are and how we can use that as an opportunity to drive more opportunities through the economy and address those skills gaps.
Yeah. So a lot of work to be done. John, Ollie, maybe John first. I mean, do you want to how much of this resonates with you? How much is different in the resi sector? What are the challenges for you?
Yeah, we'd echo the sentiments of the rest of the panel. We're pivoting away from gas-led infrastructure, so it's all air source, ground source, heat pumps on all our new schemes. We're future-proofing with EV charging. That does present its challenges in that there are concerns around grid capacity. Obviously, West London, it's been very well documented. You know, we've got schemes in West London trying to get connection to the grid, and you know, we're going to need 20 million more heat pumps, 30 million more EV charging. So appreciate that's a wider conversation than perhaps for this group, but something we need to be cognizant of. We're mindful of FLOSS regulations, so building regulations, interim future home standards just come in, so we're all acclimatising. Ollie will sympathise, I'm sure, with that. As has been said, we're installing, you know, a lot of smart metering to get good post-occupancy evaluation of building performance. We're working closely with the GLA and the London Mayor's team with regards to his B-scene strategy to really deep dive and really understand the performance gap there. And we're trying to shift our supply chain mentality to not design for compliance, but to design for performance. So I think that's an institutional shift as part of planning applications and stuff, and engaging earlier with M&E suppliers. So from an operational perspective, I'd encourage that. From a supply chain perspective, we work really closely with the Supply Chain Sustainability School. There's a lot of literature and a lot of available tools as well. So they do have a carbon reporting tool that suppliers can go in and detail what their Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions are, which get allocated across to companies in the built environment. So a bit of a flag for the Supply Chain Sustainability School as well.
I mean, Ollie, you know, at Barratt, you work on single-family homes, so it's slightly different typology to all of these, you know, massive hundreds of thousands of square meters of space at a time. Does that?
I don't know who has the better job. I'm trying to work it out yet. Well, who has the harder job? Maybe I should have said. So I mean, everyone owns a home, so that has its advantages and disadvantages. And so, just for clarity, what are we going to do? We're going to go at fabric, so double the amount of fabric we're going to put in your home. We're going to put PVs on it. We're going to put some sort of a heat pump. We're going to do heat recovery, so we're going to recover the heat from your boiler or your heat pump or from the air. We're going to put water-saving technology in there, and we're going to go at air tightness. So we're going to basically go from air tightness, this is the size of this table, to air tightness coming out of your home the size of a postage stamp. Why can't we do that tomorrow? So the reason we can't do that tomorrow is, one, there isn't clarity on consistency in regulation currently. So future homes for house builders is the way it's going, but they haven't actually said what it's going to be. And the last regulation was a bit of a mess, and we've really struggled with it. They introduced an overheating standard that hadn't been well thought through, and we've had to work through it. Now, I think we've all recognised that, and house builders are working with government in something called the Future Homes Hub and supply chain. We need capacity, so 600,000 air source heat pumps will hit our shores 26, 27. We need 20,000 more installers. I'm not worried about the capacity because these products are made by people like Mitsubishi and Samsung and some big companies out there. I am worried about capability, and you touched on skills. I work in an industry that's already lacking 40,000, so we've got a gap today of 40,000 to add on to the 250,000 green jobs that we need. Consumer confidence, obviously, for us is big. So right now, when I'm putting air source heat pumps into people's homes, what they're telling me is they've got a friend at the pub that's got an air source heat pump that doesn't work, that's really noisy, but that was 20 years ago. So I've got to get over that hump. I've got some benefits, so I'm trying to angle and enable it with things like green mortgages, so we're working very closely with green finance. That isn't where it needs to be. It's sort of only touching on the side, and then I really touch on what yours, data. So we've got lots of many will now have Google Nest or Hive or something in their homes. That is collecting unique, once and really useful, I'm an engineer, data that I can then use to ensure that people drive their homes in the right miles per gallon, and then link it to green mortgages or link it to insurance companies. So I think for us, the challenges are big, but the opportunities are even bigger. And it just needs a one sort of thinking together. And our job, I think my job as Barratt's, is to set the targets and enable it. So
I think what's comforting, if that's the right word, is that there's a fairly good understanding of the challenges, right? This is not uncharted territory. We don't know where we need to go. We know that there's 250,000 jobs need creating. We know that there's issues around consistency. There's issues around the performance gap, as you put it. And maybe we'll just come back to that in a second. I wanted to throw in a sort of elephant in the room question to you, Ollie, actually. One thing that wasn't mentioned throughout any of that was hydrogen. So I just want to ask straight up, is it something that Barratt's are talking about? And if not, why not?
So we've reviewed it. I suppose a simple answer is hydrogen is better used in heavy industry, cars, batteries and other things, not for house building. I think you'll get a few sites for non-domestic and domestic close to a hydrogen centre, but no.
Yeah.
And I think there was an article, I think one of the ministers has come out saying, look, or a paper's just come out saying, look, stop messing the building industry around and sort of offering hydrogen out. Kill it. Let's go with, because hydrogen's better placed in other areas.
I agree.
So it's too expensive.
Yeah. I agree, and I just wanted to put it out there because I was hoping you'd agree with me on this. It's needed.
Two things though, sorry, on your point, which is really one is, you've got a panel of experts here. We are 3% of the 97% that need to know this stuff. So I think you said we know everything. I think the problem is there's a lot of people that like
Sharing.
small house builders and big house builders. Sorry, I just wanted to pick that point because I think that's quite important to highlight.
I like the fact that you don't include yourself in that panel of experts. You're very much pointed over there. I think maybe you should push your chair to the left slightly. I'd include you in that. What about this performance gap piece then? So what's happening in real estate? You're fairly, in terms of the sort of commercial sector, pretty far ahead now, I'd say, in terms of understanding the difference between what's designed in a building from an operational energy use and what then actually happens. The reality is people leave windows open, air conditioning systems get left on overnight, computers get left on when there's no one sat at them. What's the understanding and what's driving a change in that? What's going to happen to close that gap? I don't know, Claire, do you want to? Yeah.
Shall I go?
Go for it.
Okay, what I'd say we're sort of trying to address this through several means, but sort of fundamentally driving cultural change in this space. And so that's a mixture of perhaps carrot and stick that's driving through with our customers, talking about green leases, with our procurement activities, talking about standardized, incentivized performance contracts to reduce carbon, putting the responsibility of the building performance with the asset management team so that they are judged on that. So really sort of trying to just shift the culture to be constantly thinking about how these buildings are operated. And quite often, there's a simple solution in place and you find these buildings are operating with both heating and cooling at the same time. You need to switch them off. You could save 20% overnight. So so sort of through our supply chains, trying to do both a kind of carrot and stick approach, both obligating it through the way that we are procuring and entering into agreements with our customers and procuring with our supply chain, but also recognizing that it's our scope 3 emissions and we are here, we need to support and help, and it's about training and awareness. And one of the things we've done recently is embed a really highly skilled technical engineering team within a company that so you can set these standards, but then actually they can go around guiding and helping our customers and our supply chain in sort of achieving that and seeing where these tweaks of a BMS might be. And some of these things are sort of out of the skill set perhaps of our kind of standard customer operation, but just raising that awareness. So I'd say, yes, you can sort of obligate it, but you need to wrap it with a package of training, awareness, support.
So it sounds like there's sort of two ends to this, right? There's the user side of things, and then there's setting the requirements out, the sort of standard side. And I wonder if either Matt or maybe Matt, do you want to go first, and then Jenny, can we talk a bit about what is the role of sort of standards in doing this? People have heard of things like neighbours. There's the net zero carbon building standard that's going to come later this year. What's the role of things like that in closing this gap?
Yeah, that's what I was going to mention, neighbours, because I think that's a standard that many of us are aligning to. And when I think about the performance gap, it's a new build or a major refurbishment then moving into its operational life. And so having really good modelling and designers through the design stage, onboarding your engineering team a good year before that asset goes live, so they can start really understanding the control strategy and the metering strategy in that building. But then having your design team retained, and we're now writing into contracts that they must hang around for a further 4 years at 75% occupancy, so that they can really see that building in its full kind of life and operating as hard as it will do. and then use that to inform future designs, but also help our teams that run the building to understand if the control strategy has been implemented, if it's been commissioned properly, and that's where the customer engagement piece we come back to, oversight of fit-outs, writing into leases, performance criteria, and then making sure, this one's fundamental, it's just good engineering, but that fine-tuning and seasonal tuning takes place once that building is fully let and fully operational. There's so much savings to be had there, and I think it's the only way we're going to hit some of the standards that Neighbours is starting to set.
And it's a sort of closing the loop type thing, right? And Jenny, do you want to add to
No,
that?
I'm glad Matt sort of mentioned Neighbours, and I think that's what we're pushing for on government is the movement to a mandatory energy performance rating scheme alongside EPCs.
Yeah.
And EPCs are what investors know, what the market knows, but they're a moment in time. That's how the building is meant to operate, what the energy efficiency of the building, how the building is designed to operate, and it doesn't measure what those operational energy emissions are. So we believe that you need both the EPCs to ensure that the design is as efficient as possible, but then also to introduce something like the Neighbours scheme for that energy performance rating system long time.
Yeah.
And I think the experience within Australia, I think they've been running it for about 20 years now, and they've been seeing massive reductions in the energy performance of their buildings.
Yeah. It's amazing how just measuring something and working on that makes a difference, right? Rather than designing and assuming. And I think it's, the whole industry is going in this direction of designing for performance and setting limits on performance rather than on what's designed. And I've been working on, I'm part of a very big team of people working on the net zero carbon building standard. And when that comes out, that's going to set limits on operational energy use, but not in design, what's actually measured. And it's going to sort of follow Neighbours' lead in that you can't get accreditation or verification until you've got enough measured data to prove that that's how your building is actually working. It's very much to where we're going on all this. If I can, I'm going to move us on to embodied carbon, which is the materials. We're going to go from EPCs to talk about EPDs, which is a very tenuous link. And if you don't know the acronym, then sorry that it's lost on you. But in terms of embodied carbon, and maybe we can start by talking about housing this time. Again, it'd be useful to hear what the biggest challenges are. And I think, coming from what I've seen, one of the biggest challenges is about data. It's about understanding what's in those materials that you're procuring. An EPD is basically a data sheet that tells you the embodied carbon of a material along with other environmental indicators. How do you go about getting these to your projects? Are they being offered by the supply chain? What can we do to get more of them? Ollie, do you want to start?
Yeah, so I suppose I'll start with saying there's a bit of an argument between operational and embodied, because to reduce operational, you're increasing embodied in many instances. So that's where you need really careful design and consideration. So to reduce your embodied, you're introducing air source heat pumps, more insulation, PVs. That is all increasing your embodied carbon. Yeah. So you've got and doing all that also has many other effects on overheating, other things. So it's not just one of these things.
Yeah.
So, but linked to that, from an embodied carbon point of view, I think what's clear is I probably start a few years ago when it became important. It was clear that there wasn't one system of assessing embodied carbon. So there's RICS, there's a few systems out there. So we need to just agree on one, or they all need to correlate. And then after that, it's getting manufacturers to give energy performance declarations, which basically means that the company tells you the embodied carbon of their product, and then you put it into a model. Now, I would say 15%, if we're lucky, of the supply chain have EPDs on their products, if we're lucky. What we're doing about it, and many developers are doing about it, is we are slowly saying if you don't have an EPD for your product, we can't say that yet because we would go out of business, you will not be able to be on our supply chain. So that's what's going to come. And sadly, with embodied carbon, there's a little bit of a stick needed to start with before the carrot, and that is our stick. And obviously, as you know, because we're working together on it, we'd also signed up to Part Z, which is a regulatory requirement or setting a target for embodied carbon, or at least a system of measurement. I think, for me, the first step in embodied carbon journey is we as an industry agree the method and start measuring, and then we can set really clear targets. Because even if you look at Letty and Reba, which are great targets, they're a bit of a mishmash because they've sort of put high and low rise together, non-domestic, domestic, and I'll be honest, some of the targets are really easy for me because they're your targets, and I build much smaller buildings, and other targets are really hard for me because you guys have more flexibility than me, so that's probably part of the journey.
I think that piece about balancing the two is quite important, and I think
critical.
kind of what it illustrates actually to me is that the industry has been looking at operational far longer than embodied.
Yeah.
Oh, definitely.
We've got a lot of catching up to do on the material side of things. It comes out of the fact that it used to be a very small proportion of a building's whole life carbon footprint, whereas because the grid's decarbonised, because we're designing more efficient buildings, the operational side has shrunk, but materials have stayed the same. And therefore, we're now at the point
or
where
increased.
I think on Future Homes Hub's study, they showed that for a typical domestic house, it's about 50-50 split
Yep.
between embodied and operational.
When you get to
So-
2025 especially.
So clearly, we've got some catching up to do there. I wondered if, something that strikes me is, so you talk about a performance gap from an operational side of things, and there's a concern about a performance gap from an embodied side of things if we don't have that data. So I think that, asking for EPDs from the supply chain is a really key thing, and it's interesting to hear you saying that you'll move towards mandating that. I mean, does this resonate with what you're doing at Telford?
Yeah, so we're obviously a high-rise developer, so we build with a lot of concrete and steel, a lot of RC frame. Slightly different challenges to Ollie, who's maybe lower rise and could perhaps build with timber more readily. Obviously, in a post-Grenfell world, cross-laminated timber, obviously lower embodied carbon impact. So again, that's a big challenge for us. Embodied carbon is the elephant in the room. We are actively measuring whole life carbon on all our schemes going forward. We've set a staircased reduction trajectory out to 2030. So we're already we're on target already with our 2023 requirement. We've set those targets in line with LETI and the RIBA plan of works as already been referenced to. But yeah, from my perspective, I'm quite keen any sort of embodied carbon benchmarks that we disaggregate low rise from high rise, and that was something I mentioned when collaborating with the Future Homes Hub.
Yeah.
But I think we're all acclimatizing to how we measure it, and obviously some house builders are a little bit further behind in the journey. I think that was very apparent when we collaborate at the Future Homes Hub. We like to think we're a little bit further ahead. We've been measuring whole life carbon for about 18 months now, getting a lot of good data. We've got a 2019 benchmark where we looked at our sort of legacy impacts and could staircase our reduction trajectory out from that. But yes, for everyone in the room, I'd echo Ollie's sentiments. We anticipate maybe 20-30%, if we're lucky, have EPDs at the moment, maybe another third in transition. So again, we're starting to set internal targets around encouraging suppliers to have that EPDs, so we can, when we make procurement decisions, we've got that comparability on carbon intensity of products, and it better informs our whole life carbon modelling as well. So big call to arms on EPDs, please.
So I think it's interesting, isn't it? So we've got again data and consistency have both come up, the same challenges being faced from an operational point of view, and it'll be great to see that sort of data accumulate as we go forward. I think I'd argue that there is consistency now on how it's measured, and actually in the UK, the RICS professional statement is basically the only standard out there. I can see lots of nodding going on, so that's good. And I think that it does pave the way for regulation in this area, because this is one of those areas where until it's regulated, there won't be that consistency.
I think we're talking about the big elephant in the room being the embodied carbon, and I think for us as on our commercial real estate, it's the challenge of meeting these targets, and that's where supply chain engagement really does come to the fore. So, like British Land, we've got a target, an embodied carbon target for our commercial offices to reach 500 kilograms of carbon dioxide per square metre by 2030. We haven't achieved that yet. We don't know how we will achieve that. The Forge, which is our first net zero carbon building, which we actually just completed last month in Southwark, we're at 836 kilograms per square metre, and that's a net zero carbon build, fossil fuel free. We've used a really innovative new method of construction, the platform for design for manufacture and assembly, that's seen us massively reduce that embodied carbon, but we're not there yet. Our next net zero carbon building, Timber Square, and as the name suggests, we are using CLT, which it was a print work. So firstly, the thing that we've done is we've been able to retain 85% of the structure and then build floors on top of it. And we're building out of a hybrid steel and timber framework. And that's been fantastic because, A, timber is a lightweight construction material, 20 to 25% lighter than traditional building, but also it is a natural store of carbon, a sequester of carbon. Still, we're not meeting that 500 target. I think the challenges that we've had with timber, similar with the aftermath of Grenfell, we've had to work really closely and early with our supply chain, with our insurers, with London Fire Brigade to make sure that we build confidence in timber as a mass construction material. So I think that what I wanted to highlight is that to get to those embodied carbon targets that we need to get to, it is a challenge, and we need the supply chain to support us in getting there, the innovation within the supply chain to support us in getting to those targets.
Yeah, and I mean, ultimately, you're talking about the emissions due to materials, and therefore the people who provide the materials are going to need to be part of that conversation, right? And you need to be able to track it from source all the way to site.
I think it.
Matt?
Oh.
You go.
I was just going to jump in there and say, I mean, again, back to sort of reflecting on the nature of our portfolio across London, the majority of them being heritage assets, and as you touched on, sort of embodied in operation are a kind of push-pull. And so in some ways, you know, we are sort of fortuitous in that actually that those assets are going to remain, and the vast majority of our development pipeline is looking at retrofit and refurbishment as a result of that. Our struggle is really then on the operational side and how we bring that operational side down. But again, we're aligned in setting ourselves where we are doing new build, exactly the same targets, working on the LETI basis of the 500 kilograms of CO2 per metre squared, and recognising that that is extremely, extremely difficult to hit. But across the portfolio, it is very much a vast majority retrofit refurbishment programme.
Yeah.
Which helps. So just sort of bedding in all of those sort of circular economy principles and reuse of materials and the heritage finishes and things like that. So we're really, really looking at working hard on that.
I'd like to talk a bit more about the retrofit, and then we'll move on to questions. So do please post questions. And if somebody from the back could come and make this iPad work as well, that'd be great. Then I can see the questions, please. Matt, could you talk about, I mean, at BL, you have retrofit projects and new build projects, right? And there's a big difference in embodied carbon terms. If you reuse an existing building, you don't have to emit the embodied carbon associated with anything that's already there.
Yeah.
So could you reflect a bit on sort of British Land's approach to reuse versus new builds?
I mean, I don't think it's as binary as that, a new build versus a retrofit. There is a spectrum of reuse and retrofit from major refurbs. So 100 Liverpool Street is probably our first net zero building. That came out at 389 kilograms per metre squared of carbon equivalents, but that is because it made use of existing foundations and 50% of the existing structure, and that worked for that project. And so we're really proud of that one, but it won't work on all projects. And so I think there was a point I wanted to make around whole life carbon assessments, particularly on retrofits. Our net zero pathways for our operational targets are conducted on a whole life basis. So we're taking an M&E led approach and replacing boilers with air source heat pumps as and when those boilers are end of life. But I think that's really important that you understand the whole life of that initial boiler and run it until it is end of life before you then retrofit with the air source heat pump. Because if you look at it on a whole life basis, the embodied of the new air source heat pump will outweigh the efficiency gains that you'd get for replacing early. But that is a supply chain issue, being able to undertake those calculations quickly and then being able to use them to inform investment committee decisions is an ongoing challenge. And then I think you talked about performance gap. I'd call it carbon blind spots, for want of a better word, in that I think we're now getting to grips with the EPDs of the big structural elements and, you know, the big materials, rightly done, and the supply chain's been really good with that. But looking at some of the stuff that's replaced on a more frequent basis, so undertaking whole life carbon assessments for fit outs and furniture replacements and smaller items is the next challenge, and something I think collectively we probably all need to focus on in the next few years.
Yeah, just a quick one. So I've got probably about 10 local authorities and a few landowners that are currently asking me for true net zero carbon developments. So that's zero carbon operational and embodied, because some consultants have told them that it's possible. Yeah. And then, so I think, and this is the point I meant, is I think we've just, and this is where, you know, the future homes, the net zero, all the stuff we're working on is really important. That, and I spend a lot of time with these people trying to help understand the challenges of doing that, you know. So, I mean, you can get that, but you'll offset, and we don't want to do that. So I just think part of just hearing the group, one of the things I hope these sessions do, and all the work we're all doing to help, and hopefully as leaders, is try and see, don't let the good get in the way of the better. Do you know what I mean? I think we, you know, some people are just trying to, they think it's a competition, and it's not. It's about us all working towards an end, and I think that's probably the big thing that comes out, and that's where I think we all link, whether we're house building, domestic, non-domestic, refurb. I think the drumbeat is the same. You know, we need to get to zero carbon, but we need to do it at a sensible pace that's viable, where the supply chain comes on board.
I also think there's been some amazing cross-industry collaboration on this topic in the past few years, and all I can, you know, when I look at the industry, all I see is people who would consider themselves competitors working together, giving up their lunchtimes and their evenings to work on, you know, how do we meet standards, how do we set standards, how do we share data, in a way that I've never seen on any other topic in this industry. So I think people get it for a large part, that, you know, you can't do this in isolation. If you've worked out how to do something that lowers the operational carbon on a retrofit heritage project, how do you help others do the same thing? Otherwise, we're not going to get anywhere. I'm going to just run through a few of the questions we've had in. So thank you for all of those who've been posting. I want to start with one that I guess is probably the closest aligned with talking about supply chain directly, and I'm not going to put this to anyone in particular, so do just dive in if you want to. We've had a couple of questions asking the same sort of thing, which is basically around supporting SMEs within your supply chain to help deliver on these things that you're asking of them. So you all have these very complicated supply chains, and there's firms of all sizes within there, but it's the SMEs perhaps who might need the most assistance. What are you doing within your firms to help them achieve the things that you need to see change?
So, go on, John, you go.
Well, our supply chain, we've got sort of between 60 to 70% SMEs in the Telford supply chain. As I referenced earlier, we're working quite closely with the Supply Chain Sustainability School, and actually we want to arrange a Chatham House Rules roundtable conference later this year on whole life carbon and bring the school in, James Cadman as a mediator to educate, upskill, raise awareness, and I think, you know, the learning from our whole life carbon assessments, EPDs, and sort of assessments that we've done there, I think can very much help the supply chain, I think, from our perspective.
I'll openly say we're probably not doing enough with SMEs to support them with our supply chain. I mean, our key contractors are our tier 1 contractors, which are, you know, the Sir Robert McAlpines, the Maces and Kears, and they're supporting the SMEs. But what we are trying to do is we've just joined up to the Supply Chain Schools for Sustainability, and it's a fantastic resource, a body of resources to support SMEs with that carbon footprinting, with the legislation required, with jumping through the procurement loops. I know Grosvenor is doing some fantastic work with their SME partners to help them to measure their carbon footprint and to meet their procurement loops, and that's something that we're definitely looking at doing this year to support our SMEs.
One thing we're doing, and again, like Jenny, we're sort of more contracting with that tier 1 contractor market rather than the SMEs, but helping to really focus the mind around this. We've sort of restructured how we are procuring that through a set of very, very specific KPIs that are both kind of financially penalized, but also financially incentivized. So there's sort of a bonus pot system that sort of sits across the top of it. And that's really kind of, again, back to this cultural change piece, trying to kind of drive different behaviors and ways of working together. And so we're saying, you know, we recognize this is hard, guys, and we all need to be out there and pushing it. And it takes more effort than just going down the easy route of business as usual, as we've always known. But for that, we will reward that with the necessary sort of bonus incentives.
Yeah.
So,
no, I'm going to repeat things others have said.
yeah,
Okay.
just quickly more practical. So we have a guaranteed 30-day payment scheme, or which can be reduced if you're an SME, because it's the kind of thing they need. They need regular payment. They can't wait. And we're running sessions with small house builders. I've got a session with about 40 regularly, that we tell them basically what we're doing and how to deal with the regulations, and we just give our secrets away, if I'm honest with you, much to the joy of my board. So, you know, that's something that, you know, is important. And then finally, if they come up with an innovative idea, we've got about 10 running right now with Travis Perkins, Dewsons, or someone that can help them deliver into our marketplace. So we sort of do a dating service, I suppose, and that sounds a bit weird, but really to get them to be able to deliver. So if you are an SME and you're struggling, I think most of us there are a lot of systems out there to help.
Doors are open.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot to be said, isn't there, for asking the SMEs in your supply chain what they need.
Yeah.
And then trying to work out how you can give it to them rather than the other way around. You know, trying to flip that. Matt, seeing as you were so kind to duck the question, I wonder if you could start us off on the next. So there's been a few people ask about defining net zero buildings, and a few of you have mentioned the first net zero such and such. How have you gone about defining that, understanding what that means for you, and what do you see the role of the introduction of a net zero standard on this being, and does it help, does it conflict with what you're doing so far?
Yeah, well, I think it will help because it will get us all consistent and reporting on the same basis, which I think through some of the public disclosures probably isn't always clear. I mean, our definition of net zero is reducing the embodied as far as possible with the 500 kilogram target for commercial offices out to 2030. Improving the operational performance. So for new builds, it would have to be Neighbours 5-star or operating at 55 kilowatts for the base build. That's again a 2030 target. But every standing asset has this pathway to improving its efficiency by 25%. And then action as an last resort, any unmitigated carbon through design is offset through nature-based solutions. And so for 100 Liverpool Street, that was, don't quote me on figures, but a number of tons, 26,000 invested in a couple of nature-based global rainforest projects. But we are waiting, that is a self-defined alignment and waiting for standards to come forward where the industry agrees on it and we can all be secure in our disclosures that we're aligned with that.
Yeah, and then that the building across the road being net zero means the same thing as your building being net zero, right? Does anyone else? Jenny, do you want to come in on this?
Just to say, I think the best sort of framework out there is the UK Green Building Council's Net Zero Carbon Building Framework, and I know that the Net Zero Carbon Building Standard is sort of building on that, but it's exactly what Matt says. It's about reducing operational emissions, reducing embodied carbon, and fossil fuel-free energy sources.
On the energy side of things, we had a couple of sort of really specific questions about alternatives to air source heat pumps, for example. What are your thoughts on district heating and cooling networks, things like that? But I wonder if I could broaden the question a bit more. From an operational point of view, in terms of energy generation, heating and cooling generation, is there a role here to talk cross buildings between developers, between owners of adjacent plots of land? Or should we be focusing on, everyone does their bits and plugs it into a network? Does anyone...
So a couple of things on district heating, because you're starting to use renewable technologies, you can move to plastic pipes instead of steel pipes, so it's much more cost effective. And I think it's about two things. District heating works with volume, so if I can combine with some of these guys on a big site and we can share district, it's more cost effective for all of us, so it is a joined up thinking. The other thing we can all do is put batteries and PVs in our sites and we can share energy so that we can take less off the grid, because actually I think we're sharing. So I think, and there's tons of innovation outside of air source heat pumps, whether it's infrared, infrared boilers, different types of heating solutions. So I think that the space is wide open. I know everyone keeps talking about air source, but I'll be honest with you, I've probably got 60 innovations on my table around this area. All with their own sort of drivers. I don't know about non-domestic, but domestic, we've got loads of innovation coming out because the market's just opening up. It's a new, exciting time. Scary if you're technical, but new and exciting.
Yeah. Claire, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I was just going to say, we've very much been looking at that, and we have the advantage of the contiguous ownership in London to kind of really be able to look at the opportunities for district energy systems. And we're very early stages in feasibility studies, but we are developing our thinking around heat share models and the idea that commercial office assets are heat emitters, whereas hotels and residential are heat absorbers. And so how can we use our immediate buildings to link up via an ambient loop and actually give, waste heat from these commercial assets to some of these more heat intense uses like the hotels and the residential. But as I said, we're in a fortunate position because we've got this sort of contiguous ownership of assets around, and it's early stages.
There's this wonderful example down in Bath. I know we always talk about London examples, so I always try and get in something from elsewhere in the country, where I believe they're taking waste heat from the spa and they use it to provide background heating for the cathedral.
Yeah.
And they're not that far apart, but I think that sort of questioning what's around me and who's doing what is something that we need to get better at. And my other big thing I really love in this area is the reuse of steel that I'm beginning to see happen in central London. You're getting developers taking down a building that's steel frame and asking their, like I say, competitors, would any of you like to do a sort of trade with this and use it in a new project? And there's a couple of really sizable projects going up in London now, reusing somebody else's steel frame, which is amazing. Matt?
Yeah, well, we've just sold the steel frame, or part of the steel frame we've taken down from the old One Broadgate. That's going to immediate reuse. And then seen some really cool innovations around linking BIM models to the second-hand steel market. So you can bag the piece of steel that works for that particular application straight away, and it takes away that kind of one of the challenges around storage and warranties and things like that. So that's really helpful. Just back on the previous question, we're invested in a climate tech fund out in the States, and that's been really useful to kind of horizon scan a bit further. We're here to talk about innovation today. Stuff that's probably not yet commercially viable, but some really hopeful kind of technologies coming through in terms of embedding solar into facades. So generation of renewables doesn't really work in central London glass buildings. There's not enough roof space. But if you can get the facade to start generating, then that's got a lot of potential. The ability, everyone's talking about batteries and energy storage, but no one really knows how to recycle them or turn them into circular batteries. And so there's things, there's companies now kind of specialising in the refurbishment and redeployment of batteries in the future. And I had a third one. Solar carports. So the French legislation that's come in that's mandating any car park spaces over 80 are now got to put a solar carport on. That's something we're looking at across our portfolio. Big opportunity for solar deployment on retail rooftops, but also on outdoor car parks.
Yeah. And there's a need in this country for a lot more solar power, right? And I think we need to install something like 6 times as much per year as we're currently doing.
Yeah.
And actually, the built environment should be, it's a massive opportunity there because we've got all these roofs that, frankly, are usually hideous to look at and being unused. So, we can play a big part there, I think. Maybe one last question before we sort of try and wrap up, and it builds on the steel reuse point actually. Are any of you doing anything to sort of incentivize circular economy thinking on your projects in terms of the sorts of circular economy thinking that minimize emissions today, not the 50 years in the future stuff?
So I'll just jump in there. So again, I guess back to the KPIs that I was talking about with the financial incentives. So what we're doing is we're setting in the contracts a sort of an anticipated embodied carbon figure. But if that is reduced if we hit a reduced number, we are saying that there will be a financial incentive to do that. So, for example, if you are able to source more than 50% of the steel as steel reuse, that's going to bring your number down. It's going to bring the number that you're going to need to offset down. So therefore, there's the financial incentive to say, thank you very much for doing that. It's, we know how difficult it is to go to these sites to find the right, the appropriate size steel that you can reuse. And so it's embedding that into the contract.
So you're incentivizing it through embodied carbon?
Through the embodied carbon thing,
it's a quick way
because ultimately it will reduce the embodied carbon of the development if we can reuse as much steel as possible.
Anyone else? Jenny?
We, across our developments, we encourage, especially where we are sort of demolishing for redevelopment, we do materials audits reuse. So we make sure that when we are taking down, we're looking at what is getting demolished, putting a materials audit together and ensuring that we're using proportion of that on the new build. What we are doing this year is then saying, okay, when we've done that materials audit, how much percentage should we be targeting for the rebuild? 70% materials reuse, so to encourage that circular economy.
Yeah.
Thanks. I think we're out of time, I'm afraid.
That's okay.
So just as by way of sort of wrapping up, I think, a lot of what I've heard is, huge amount of action that is going on across the built environment. But still a lot of needs being put out there. We've got consistency, we've got jobs, we've got technology, we've got a better understanding of carbon and balancing it, unlocking retrofit, things like that. So, a really exciting space. And I'd encourage you all to, maybe afterwards come and ask these guys more questions on all this, because there's clearly so much more to share. So thank you all for your time, and if we could all just thank our panelists in the usual way, that would be appreciated. Thank you.